one, we've been involved in this for a long time, and we're all pretty well familiar with ISO 55000 and what it says and what it does. And a lot of people who are listening to this who are familiar with ISO 55000 are going to find the terms that we're using very familiar, because these are concepts and principles that come right out of the standard. Those of you who aren't familiar with ISO 55000 may look at it and say, well, these things make a whole lot of sense. And they do, because the standard basically is a collection of a lot of good sense. So another point I think I want to emphasize about the standard is the standard itself was designed for individual organizations. It was designed to, for a given government agency, for example, and the government agency looks at what its objectives are and what its assets are, and all these kinds of questions that we've raised here, these 6 elements, if you will, are all important things for any organization to consider. But when you're thinking about a nation is a whole collection of stuff. It's not just one organization, it's a whole lot of organizations. And so the challenge we faced with putting together this national asset leadership strategy is, how do we take the principles of ISO 55000 and apply them nationwide? And some of the ways we did that, you've just heard from Moshe and John, in terms of looking at the nation's assets, creating a taxonomy so we can talk about national assets in a consistent way. All these things are important when you're talking about applying an organization-focused standard, if you will, onto a collection of organizations. So once we got to this point, we started thinking, okay, so now that we think we have these basic principles down pretty solid, they make a whole lot of sense to us, what do we do now? And so as we were thinking about taking the foundational elements of the National Asset Leadership Strategy and turning it into an implementation strategy, we took a closer look at the stakeholders. We looked at the asset owners and operators, because they all, that's who, those are the people whose behavior we want to change. I mean, those are the people whom we want to implement effective asset management systems so that they become more effective in accomplishing their missions. So they're really the main target audience for what we're doing. But then you look at the influencers, and the influencers are all over the map. They range, like in the federal government, you've got congressional committees, subcommittees, you've got oversight agencies like OMB and GAO and CBO and others. You've got and the private, you've got regulatory agencies that affect not only government agencies, but also private sector agencies. So there are a lot of different players that influence the asset owners and operators. And so when you think about how you want to engage those, it turns out that they naturally fall into sectors. So if you think about the economy, you've got, in fact, that's the way we normally talk about the country. We say infrastructure sectors. So it's energy sector, transportation sector. And it turns out that each sector has its own unique set of organizations that are asset owners and operators. They kind of cluster according to sector. You also, on the influencer side, you have influencers that cluster by sector. You have congressional committees and subcommittees that focus on specific sectors. You have professional associations, some of whom cut across sectors, others who focus narrowly on sectors. And so the sector-based approach seemed to us to be the most promising path forward. And so what we did is we put together a sector asset leadership strategy. And one of the components of that strategy that's extremely important is collecting information about each sector so that we can map a path forward. Each sector is going to have different characteristics, and some of those characteristics are going to provide opportunities, because we're going to find organizations in certain sectors that have already embraced ISO 55000. Some may have been certified to it, others haven't been certified, but they've adopted it. So they're voices of experience in applying this standard to within their sector. You've got other organizations. In fact, when you think around the world, a lot of countries have focused on specific sectors, and they've actually required the use of ISO 55000 by organizations in the sector, because those sectors are considered part of their critical national infrastructure. That then generally applies to water, wastewater, it applies to energy, sometimes applies to transportation. It just depends on the country. We haven't done that in this country yet, but maybe that's something that could evolve from what we're trying to do here.